Yeah, we just reason that I didn't show up tonight is that Shirley was not feeling too well, so we just within the last 5 minutes did a rapid test, and she did test positive. So hopefully everybody will be back next week. Thank you for all the prayers, and I think we're probably good to go. What I wanted to do, again, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. This is a little awkward because I can't always, determine and read what's going on. I like to be able to read the crowd, so to speak, and it's kind of a tough thing to do in this situation. But a couple of articles here, if I can just find them. I want to see if I can show you something. I don't know if this will show up or well. Bob, can you possibly show that video?
Implants are a very versatile technology that can be used for many different things. And right now it's very convenient to have a COVID passport always accessible on your implant. One article that I came across that I thought was kind of interesting, and again, so much going on right now, it's kind of hard to keep up. But this is an article by a fellow by the name of Britt Gillette, and I came across him a couple of weeks ago, and I know that Tom Owens and others have referenced him. And what he did was discuss the what he considered to be the three main events or situations relative to Bible prophecy and what's happened in 2021. And so the big three that he talks about are big tech censorship, broken global supply chain, and our loss of liberty. So let me just highlight some of these if I could. This is what he says under big tech censorship. First of all, he did state that the number one sign of the second coming is the convergence of all the signs Jesus and the prophets said to look for. Jesus said, quote, "When you see all these things take place, look up. Your salvation draws near." Luke 21:28. What are the things Jesus and the prophets said to look for? Israel back in the land, Jeremiah 23:7-8. The Jewish people back in control of Jerusalem, Luke 21:24. The gospel being preached to the whole world. And of course we know that is fulfilled during the tribulation, but it's being preached more today than perhaps it ever has been before. Today we see these signs. Because we can be confident we live in the season of his return. But Jesus cited other signs too. So did the prophets. And we see those signs as well. As 2021 draws to a close, what were the biggest prophetic news story? Below are a list of what I believe this author, Britt, believes are the top three. Big tech censorship. As people become more reliant on smart devices and the internet for daily living, the power of big tech companies like Google has grown exponentially. These companies have the power to control the news and information flow for billions of people. That hasn't gone unnoticed by power-hungry politicians across the globe. They long to wield this power for their own benefit, and I think that's really what's driving a lot of what we're seeing throughout the world today is this quest for absolute power by many, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Unfortunately, big tech has been more than willing to help. For example, back in July, White House Secretary Jen Psaki announced White House officials were, quote, meeting with social media platforms and had, again, quote, increased disinformation research and tracking. So disinformation to them is anything that is counter to their worldview or what they deem to be truth. So those of us that talk about Bible prophecy or might say something that doesn't exactly line up with what they're saying would be, in their minds, disinformation. She added the administration was flagging problematic posts from Facebook that spread the disinformation and working to connect doctors and medical professionals who are popular with their audiences with correct information so as to, quote, boost trusted content. Of course, trusted content is always in the eyes of the beholder. The U.S. Surgeon General followed with his own lecture on the dangers of free thought. The dangers of free thought. According to Dr. Vivek Murthy, quote, we live in a world where misinformation poses an imminent threat and insidious threat to our nation's health. Health misinformation is false, inaccurate, or misleading information about health according to the best evidence of the time. And while it often appears innocuous on social media apps, on retail sites such as search engines, the truth is that misinformation takes away from our freedom to make informed decisions about our health and the health of our loved ones. Think about that. The Surgeon General thinks that if you have access to uncensored information, it takes away your freedom. It takes away your freedom. Only in a dystopian 1984 society does an assertion like that make any sense. In the same month, Politico reported, quote, Biden-allied groups, including the Democratic National Committee, are also planning to engage fact-checkers more aggressively and work with SMS carriers to dispel misinformation about vaccine that is sent over social media and text messages. We're already seeing that with censorship of YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. That if anybody or if anything is stated that might contradict or seemingly not necessarily line up with what they're telling us, they just simply block it. They just simply shut it down. We've seen that over and over again. Again, if they can block the 45th president of the United States, they can block anybody. This means government authorities might, quote, fact-check future private text messages between you and your friends. Imagine being in the middle of a phone call with a friend and the government cuts off your phone call because the two of you are discussing, quote, disinformation. Most people would be outraged, yet that's exactly what the government is doing with this social media disinformation censorship campaign. All is a threat to human freedom and liberty. We now live in a world where the largest technology firms have more power than most totalitarian governments had in bygone eras. And that lends some some insight into, if you remember, Prince Charles' talk at the COP23 conference in Davos, where he gave the speech and said that that I don't have the quote right in front of me precisely, but he basically said what we need is a military style effort to marshal the trillions of dollars of GDP that exists throughout the world. And that we should have it, or that all of this money, and you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars, and it's right, again, I'm paraphrasing, but it's right out of his speech, which is available if you just want to look it up. Look up Prince Charles' speech at Davos, and you can find it's only a couple of pages long. But he says we need to marshal a military style effort to marshal and to bring under control the trillions of dollars of GDP. And he said so that, and this was interesting, and this has kind of gone through the prophecy community quite a bit, if you will. I've heard it mentioned on a lot of different sites, but so that he, or at his this funding is at his disposal. And he never identified who he or his or him is. It seems as though he's referencing someone who's behind the scenes, perhaps pulling the strings. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that's Antichrist or anything like that, but who's to say it's not an Antichrist-like individual, somebody that's being prepared? But it's very interesting that he would say that. And to marshal trillions and trillions of dollars of GDP, in other words, to bring it all in to a one world government, trillions and trillions of dollars is more than all the GDP of the world governments combined. So what's he talking about? He's probably talking about something different, something new, perhaps a digital currency that is under the control of him or he, or what will ultimately be a new 10-member governmental entity under the leadership of Antichrist. So I think what we're seeing here is all this stuff coming together, the tools being brought together to make it possible that when Antichrist comes on the scene, that really all, and we've talked about this many times, but all I have to do is to pull the switch and he'll be ready to go. We live in a world where the largest technology firms have more power than most totalitarian governments had in bygone eras. Since the police power of government rules over these big tech companies, that means governments around the world are now more powerful than they've ever been. The power and reach of big tech is global in nature, and they've shown their willingness to use this power to silence you. So interesting that he looks at as technology and the use of technology is one of the things that he sees as a big event. And I thought when I first saw the Twitter and Facebook and others censoring a former president, it just, to me, that was very unsettling. It was just something that we had not seen before. In 2021, big tech continued to cancel people and organizations deemed, quote, dangerous or not sufficiently woke. YouTube channels were demonized, demonetized, and shut down. Twitter and Facebook accounts were suspended. Hosting companies dropped websites, and businesses were frozen out of using PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard. As technology continues to advance, every aspect of human life becomes more reliant on and intertwined with digital payments and the internet. If access to those utilities is cut off, an individual's ability to participate in modern-day society is also cut off. That means large corporations and governments by default can cut you off from society for any reason. And I think with 2022 and beyond, we're going to see a lot more of that, which ultimately will lead to, again, Antichrist's kingdom and the fulfillment of much of Revelation 13. The second big big event that he speaks about is the broken global supply chain. The spread of COVID-19 in early 2020 marked the beginning of a global supply chain crisis. That crisis continued throughout all of 2021. The most recent example of broken supply chain showed up in the form of shipping problems at U.S. ports. For example, on November 11th, a record 111 container ships were anchored off the coast of two California ports. This broke the previous record set just 20 days earlier. In response, Joe Biden promised to strengthen the resiliency of the supply chain by moving to 24/7 operations at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. He was concerned about the Christmas shopping season and public opinion in an era of product shortages and rising inflation. But this is a much more complex issue. The problems involving bottlenecks in these ports are a symptom of a larger systemic breakdown, a breakdown that threatens to collapse the entire global economic system. Despite the optimistic forecasts of politicians, the broken supply chain didn't repair itself, and it won't be fixed in 2022 either. 24/7 port operations won't fix the problems. Containers cover every square inch of the ports in LA and Long Beach. Before new containers can be offloaded from ships, trucks and trains need to move the existing containers to new locations. The nationwide shortage of truck drivers makes that a tall order. In 2021, the problem wasn't confined to California ports alone. Supply chain problems and shortages plagued almost every industry and factory in the world, covering a wide range of products such as bacon, semiconductors, toilet paper, aluminum, pet food, juice boxes, and hosts of other items. When COVID first struck, the global economy came to an abrupt halt. And you have to ask ourselves, could it possibly have been by design? Was there an intentional dismantling, or is there an intentional dismantling of our system that is happening? Is it just coincidental that all of these illegal aliens are flooding into the country? Is it intentional or possibly coincidental that we're seeing inflation at record highs? Is it intentional, as I heard the other day, that we'll likely see gas prices, on average $4 or more a gallon by summer? Is it intentional that natural gas and electric and inflation, are all spiking? I'm just not prepared to say that it's all coincidental. I think that we have to at least consider the fact, or consider the possibility, let's put it that way, that there are forces behind all of this, moving us toward that one world system. We've talked about that over and over again, and my guess is that we're going to see more and more of that. Natural gas prices, and we're going to remember, this isn't just a U.S. problem; it's worldwide. Natural gas prices in Europe tripled in 5 months. European natural gas is now 10 times more expensive than the United States. Meanwhile, much of Europe is now hostage to Vladimir Putin, as they've allowed themselves to become dependent on Russian energy supplies. In China, coal, which generates 50% of the nation's electricity, is becoming harder and harder to source. These higher energy prices mean higher costs for businesses and consumers. It also means energy shortages and rolling blackouts. These energy disruptions are then result in additional production shutdowns. To me, one of the more dangerous things that the world's going to deal with is this whole China situation. Everybody thinks China is going to be the next superpower, and I think militarily they can be, but their economies in the world hurt, and the yuan is being attacked, and they're suffering from from economic problems just like we are. And then if you consider, as an aside, what's going on between China and Taiwan, and we have to ask ourselves, is China just waiting for the Olympics to take place and then make a move on Taiwan? And I'm still trying to figure out. I was talking to, I think, Jack the other day about this, and that I had heard on a news station that if China attacks Taiwan, that'll excuse me, quote, be catastrophic for the United States. I don't know what that means, other than we may have to engage them militarily, which would indeed be catastrophic. One of the things that we all know that Jesus said to be on the lookout for as we get close to the end times is nation against nation, which is the Greek word for that is ethnos, or people groups. There'll be an escalation of nations, people groups battling against each other. If you think about what's going on in the Middle East and in Russia and Russia, what they're doing with the name of the country escapes me right at the moment, but Russia and then China, Taiwan, and Israel and Iran, to say nothing about Hezbollah and so on and so forth. We're seeing an escalation of that prophecy throughout the world, just as Jesus said. Along with everything else, we're seeing a spike in nation against nations. Meanwhile, much of Europe is now hostage to Vladimir Putin as they've allowed themselves to become dependent on Russian energy supplies. Also means energy shortages and rolling blackouts. And the third item that he said really kind of stood out to him was loss of liberty. If you love freedom and liberty, 2021 was not your year. Many Western nations that traditionally espouse individual freedom and liberty either took steps down the road toward totalitarianism or transformed into outright police states. While the list of such nations is long, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Canada, New Zealand, etc., none provides a better example of this transformation than Australia. In 2021, Australia descended into a police state. The government of South Australia rolled out a new app requiring citizens to take a photo of themselves and report their location on demand within 15 minutes of a government request. Also in September, Australian MP, who's I believe the leader, one of the leaders of the Australian government, Daniel Andrews, vowed to, quote, lock out the unvaccinated, and sure enough, they're doing that. They're putting them in camps in regard to medical care and conducting commerce. Earlier this month, 3 teenagers escaped from one of these facilities. Their escape launched a full-blown manhunt, complete with roadblocks and police officers randomly searching vehicles. Barring a revolutionary pushback, Australia is lost. And I know that there are those that I've listened to, and I'm sure that Rick and others have listened as well, that think that Australia and Canada, which is also becoming pretty draconian in the way they are controlling the population, are possible test sites, because they're not third world nations. They are Western world or free world countries. At least they have been. And could be just a test to see how people respond as the government becomes more totalitarian, which is exactly what happens when socialism takes over. That people soon come to the realization it doesn't work. They have to implement totalitarianism. One thing that, and again, this is pure speculation on my part, but all of this defending of the police activity that we've seen, some of it's is coming back to bite them, certainly with a radical spike in crime and murders and so forth. But consider the possibility that there's a behind-the-scenes attempt to bring about a federal military/police agency that can easily be melded into this new world system. Just a thought. Otherwise, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense what they're doing. The purpose is to ostracize the unvaccinated from society, to apply maximum pressure and coerce the unvaccinated into compliance. Does any of this sound familiar? It should. The book of Revelation describes a similar system whereby the people of the world are forced to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead. Those who refuse to comply will be unable, we know this, to buy or sell. They'll effectively be cut off from society. Vaccine mandates and passports create the same type of system. They create a social system enabling the mark of the beast. I don't believe vaccine passports are the mark of the beast. However, if they are allowed to stand, they will create a system indistinguishable from the actual mark of the beast. And that's another thing that's being pushed. And I had a video. I'll show it next week. It's an advertisement for a company out of Sweden. And it's interesting because I think I mentioned the last time, in Sweden, the people are accepting, if you will, the idea of being chipped, having a microchip about the size of a grain of rice embedded in their arm or someplace on their body. And the fellow that, I forget the name of the company right off the top of my head, but again, I'll show it next week. But the fellow that is pushing this product says that it's very convenient to have your COVID passport chipped in your, included in the chip. And then there's new technology that will allow this chip to connect to your financial records and everything else. I don't know if you knew, but the Build Back Better plan, which is really a socialist dream plan, if you will. Hopefully it never does come to fruition. Looks pretty good right now, but that embedded in there are all kinds of draconian proposals, including having shut-off capabilities in people's automobiles, so that if somebody is driving perhaps more than they should, or they've been caught saying something that is contrary to what they should be talking about, they'll just shut their cars right down, wherever they might be. So that is seriously a part of Build Back Better, along with a lot of other very draconian items that were contained in there. What to look for in 2022? Hopefully Jesus will return, which he well could. I mean, like we've said many times, that if we see all the signs of Christmas, the decorations in the stores and the trees being decorated, that means Thanksgiving can't be far behind, can't be far off. So expect these same trends to continue in 2022. Look for big tech to continue its crackdown on any ideas that run counter to the official government narrative. Look for the global supply chain problems to get worse. Most of all, look for governments around the world to use every new COVID variant as a convenient excuse to trample freedom and liberty and seize even greater amounts of power. I have to tell you that earlier today, I was in line for 2 hours waiting to get a COVID at-home test kit. And obviously, if I'm in line for 2 hours, and this is happening all over the country, people are waiting to get COVID test kits to determine if the only variant that I think there might still be some evidence of the Delta, but the primary variant right now is Omicron, which the symptoms include a possible headache, stuffing, runny nose, and fatigue. Those are the three primary symptoms. And in fact, there are those that will say that the Omicron is really the best thing because it is not very virulent, very contagious, but that I did hear one doctor today say by April or May, this could effectively end the pandemic. So because it will be herd immunity, and that's something that maybe Megan at some point in time could could comment upon. I see Megan Caldwell is back on with us, and she's our resident scientist, so she can help us with that. So combine these developments with countless others foretold in the Bible, and we know the rapture, the tribulation, and the second coming are closer than they've ever been before. This is why the number one event we should focus on in 2022 is the return of our Savior. As we enter into a new year, all the signs tell us Jesus is coming. So that's just kind of some highlights that I picked up on. I've got others, but I want to get back into our actual study here, and we'll pick up on the rest of this next time. I do want to comment on a couple of other things that I came across, because we're talking a lot about Israel. And tonight, I want to, and I know we've, I think, done this study before, but I want to go through a couple of chapters in the book of Ezekiel and talk a little bit about what many, and I certainly do not disagree, believe are the two of the most important chapters in terms of Bible prophecy in the whole Bible. And that's chapters 36 and 37, and I want to get into that. One of the things that we'll see as we go through this study is that God is on Israel's side, clearly. Even though they have not always obeyed him, they've not always followed his commands and followed his decrees and commands, and they even rejected Christ as their Messiah. And as a result of that, the Jews have been let's call it punished or put in the woodshed by God for upwards to 2,400 years. And this is we're living in a time that's just absolutely amazing when it comes to Israel. And we'll get to that in a moment. But some of the other things that we're seeing, which absolutely is also very prophetic, is an explosion of anti-Semitism. We're seeing it throughout the United States. We're seeing it in the universities. I have an article here that is entitled Anti-Semitic Incidents Rose by 35% in Australia and between 2020 and 2021. Anti-Semitism is spiking like crazy in Europe and in places. And granted, in some places it's not bad, but we're seeing a spike almost to the extent in some places that rivals what we saw just before, what the world saw just before before World War II. What's called the demonization of the Jewish people, and that's how it all started. It started with propaganda that Hitler implemented, and people began to believe, and then ultimately led to the night of the broken glass, where in Germany all of the Jewish-owned facilities and stores were destroyed and burned. Sound familiar? Destruction of property, and then ultimately the Jews were taken off, and we know the rest of the story. So what we're seeing throughout the world today is very reminiscent of what happened during that horrible period of history. And I'll certainly be spending more time on this as time goes by, because it is very important. And it's something that really speaks to the soon coming of Jesus Christ. We're going to see more and more anti-Israel activity taking place. So let's turn our Bibles, if we could, to Ezekiel chapter 36. And before we get to that, just a little in the way of background. Let's talk a little bit about the book of Ezekiel. When we get to chapter 36 of Ezekiel, to the very end, which is chapter 48, those chapters are all chronological in terms of what's going to happen in the future. Chapters 40 to 48 deal with the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That's when he comes back and and sets up a monarchy, if you will, under his leadership. And the Bible is very clear when it says that we, members of the church, are going to rule and reign with him. So he's going to be ruling the earth in perfect righteousness for that 1,000-year period, after which we go into the eternal kingdom. But during that period of time, so 40 to 48, deals with that, deals with the rebuilding of a temple, deals with the freshening of the Dead Sea and a river that's going to flow under the rebuilt temple that Jesus will reign from, and just incredibly glorious time in terms of the earth and the rule, and just how great it's going to be after he returns. 38 and 39 deal with the Gog-Magog war, which I can tell you, and we've talked about this, and we need to spend some fair amount of time bringing ourselves up to speed, but the Gog-Magog war is outlined in 38 and 39 of Ezekiel. References an attack or an attempted attack by 5 different nations against Israel in the latter days. It clearly, as we go through that, we'll see that this event takes place in the latter days. And to put it in perspective, Ezekiel was written probably somewhere around around certainly 586 BC and before, during that period of time, because the Babylonian Empire attacked and took over the Judea, Jerusalem, Israel, or southern Israel in 586 BC, and we know that Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Daniel were all contemporaries in that same period of time. So the prophecies that we're going to talk about, 36, 37, and 38, 39, were recorded 2,400 years ago. And we're seeing them play out on the world stage today. What we're seeing in the Middle East with Iran and Russia and Turkey is just, and we'll get more involved in this at a later time, but it's just, you just can't make this stuff up, that it's actually coming into play exactly as God recorded through the prophet Ezekiel. It talks about, as we'll see in just a moment, as we get into 36 and 37, the land of Israel. And what we need to remember, if we remember when we were first going through the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15, God identified to Abram the land that was going to be given to the Jewish people, the land that they would control. And I have included, I don't know if Bob can show it or not, but we have a couple of maps which I took into perspective, kind of what's happened in terms of the land. But the land that God originally made clear to Abram that he and his descendants would own. And then basically what we're saying is that God gave the Jewish people title deed to control his land, which is far, far greater than what they currently occupy. And the amount of land that he gave to them, which kind of extends, I don't know if we got the map or not, but the very first map shows all of the land that God gave to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It includes parts of Egypt, certainly all of Gaza, all of Jordan, parts of Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, parts of Syria, a huge territory, some 350,000 square miles that God said, this is your land. This is the land that I am giving to you and your descendants as an everlasting inheritance. At no time in history have the Jews occupied or have they been able to control all the land. But somehow, when Jesus comes back and Israel, and the Jews that are here when he does return, finally accept Christ, then that land is going to be given, all of it, to them. And at no time have they ever controlled or occupied all of it. To the contrary, for 2,600 years, they weren't even in the land. They weren't allowed to occupy or dwell in the land. God dispersed them and scattered them throughout the world. So for 2,600 years, they were under the control of the Egyptians, and then they were under the control of the Babylonians and the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Spanish Inquisition, the Muslim Arabs, the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, the British Empire. They've been under the control of one empire after another. And it wasn't until 1948, and we'll come back to that in a moment, when after 2,600 years, something very, very miraculous happened. For the first time in all of that time, David Ben-Gurion, the then Prime Minister of Israel, declared that Israel is their land. So they've been under that dispersion, the scattering of the land for all of those years. So I also have a map that shows that during the time of David, they did occupy or control a pretty significant portion of all the land that God gave to them, but still not all of it. And then finally, when they were scattered and the land became desolate, and as Mark Twain said, not even a respectable weed would grow in that land, that it became so dry and desolate. But during or right after World War I, the British Empire, under a guy by the name of Balfour, Lord Balfour, issued a declaration called the Balfour Declaration that for the first time stated that Israel, the Jews, have a right to their own land. And then fast forward to right after World War II, that land was actually partitioned or identified. In the third map that I have in that grouping, hopefully you can see it. If not, we'll take a closer look at it next week. But that map shows what was partitioned between Israel and Jordan. It was called Transjordan, Israel and Transjordan. It was a pretty big parcel of land that included basically all of what we know to be Jordan. And the Hussein family, which is still in control today of Jordan, objected to that partition. So Winston Churchill came along and took a pen and drew a line essentially down the Jordan River Valley. And everything west of that is what ultimately became Israel, what we know today to be the nation of Israel. So today, Israel, about the size of New Jersey, occupies about 8,000 square miles versus what God gave them, some 350,000 square miles. And so you see that all of the land that he's given to them has been divided and parsed and cut up. And even today, we have certainly in the United States and other places, in Saudi Arabia and others, putting forth plans to further divide the land of Israel. And what we need to remember, and we'll see as we go through chapter 36, that's God's land. And his name is attached to that land. Yes, he's given it to them to control and occupy, but it's his land. And so if if we read in Joel, for example, where it says that Armageddon is going to come about essentially for two primary reasons. Number one, they, the nations, scattered my people, and number two, they, the nations, divided my land. So it's already been divided to the point where if any more is carved out of it, Israel ceases to exist, because that little 8,000 square mile piece of territory would no longer be defensible. So just see what's happened throughout history and where we are. But amazingly, it was after 2,600 years of being in dispersion. Most of the Jews were scattered throughout the entire world, and all spoke different languages, which we'll see in a moment was something that had to be changed, and was in fulfillment of another prophecy. But for all of that time, Israel had no land, had no government, no common language. The people that did, the Jews that did remain in what we today know to be Israel, have forever been under the dominance of other nations. So then, lo and behold, after Israel is declared by the United Nations and agreed to by Churchill and others, when that final partition was cut up, Israel said, "Hey, you have an 8,000 square miles, or even at that point less, because they've since added what we today know to be the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights." They didn't have those at the very beginning, and so their territory has grown since then. But in 1948, May 14th, 1948, after 2,600 years, David Ben-Gurion, the then prime minister of the new state of Israel, said, Israel is a state. We declare Israel to be the land that's been partitioned and given to us to be the state of Israel. Isaiah chapter 66, verse 8, or verse 8 in chapter 66 says, "Who could imagine," and I'm paraphrasing, "that a nation could be born in one day?" One day. But that's exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. In one day, Israel, after 2,600 years, put that into your minds and just let it kind of sink in. In one day, Israel becomes a nation again. Absolutely amazing. 11 minutes later, President Harry Truman called and said he approved what Ben-Gurion had just done. He didn't provide any support, military support, because it was the very next day that Egypt and Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and Saudi Arabia declared that they were going to attack Israel. And the leader of the Arab League said this is a battle of extinction, and will be, I forget exactly how he put it, the battle of extinction and something else. Anyway, I'll come back to it. So we have this situation where the very next day, after being declared a state, they're attacked by 6 Arab nations. At the time, Israel didn't have any cannons. They didn't have any tanks. They had 9 antiquated airplanes. They had 90,000 troops or people ready to fight. They had to smuggle weapons from places like Czechoslovakia and other things. There was no way they were going to defeat this huge confederacy of nations. But yet when the dust settled, guess what? Israel won. And the only explanation for that was that God had to have, or God miraculously brought them through that. He was there after 2,600 years. He fulfilled Isaiah 66. He saw them through that battle, and then every war since then, Israel has won. So 586 BC, which is when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar first attacked Jerusalem and took back captives into Babylon, again, in fulfillment of a prophecy that we find in the book of Jeremiah, that they would be held captive in Babylon for 70 years. And it's exactly what happened. They were captive in Babylon for 70 years. So that basically was the time when this dispersion of the Jews and everything began. And then in roughly 135 AD was when the final diaspora dispersion took place, when the Jews were finally kicked out of Israel completely by the Romans under a guy by the name of Hadrian, who hated with a passion the Jewish people. He had the whole city plowed under, and he renamed it Syria Philistina. That's what he named it. He named it after Israel's arch enemies, the Philistines, from which we get the name Palestine. Syria Palestina. That's where it came from. It was a pejorative. It was meant to insult and hurt the Jewish people by renaming Jerusalem, Syria, and Israel, Syria Palestina. So that's where that came from. But yet, over time, that land, and you even find it in some Bible maps in some of our Bibles. I don't think it's in mine, but if you look in the maps of some translations of the Bible, you'll see Israel referred to as Palestine. You won't find the word Palestine anywhere in the Bible. It's a made-up piece of propaganda that the Arabs used to make it sound as though it's their land and so forth. So let's go to Ezekiel 36. And I want to read verses 1 through 7, which I think pretty much stand on their own. In Ezekiel 36, it says, Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, Mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The enemy said to you, Aha, the ancient heights have become our possession. Exactly what's happened to Israel throughout history. Exactly what continues to be the desire of radical Islam and probably much of Islam today. So the ancient heights have become our possession. We've taken it over. This is 580 or so BC. Therefore, prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because they, those nations, ravaged and crushed you from every side, so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations and the object of people's malicious talk and slander. Therefore, mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and to the hills, to the ravines and the valleys, to the desolate ruins. So it's referencing the time period when Israel was desolate and lied in ruins and nothing could grow there. Desolate ruins, and they deserted towns and have plundered and ridiculed the rest of the nations around you. This is what the sovereign Lord says. In my burning zeal, you could say in my anger, I have spoken against the rest of the nations. Why? Why did he speak against them? Because of what he said up above. They have taken possession of the hills and mountains and of Israel. And because of that, remember, we read in Zechariah that Israel, the Jewish people, are the apple of God's eye. And so when people are persecuting the Jews and taking over the land or attempting to, it's like sticking your finger in God's eye. It's his. And that's how much it means to him. Therefore, mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and the hills, to the ravines and the valleys, to the desolate ruins and the deserted towns that have been plundered and ridiculed by the rest of the nations around you. Think about that. Think of the nations around them. All enemies. And There are many, and I think Amir is one that feels that Psalm 83, which talks about nations that surround Israel conspiring against God, it doesn't specifically say there's going to be a war, but it does say that God will defeat them. And he believes that that's what occurred in 1948 when all of the nations that surrounded Israel were ultimately defeated by this fledgling Israeli nation. And I think that's probably true. In my burning zeal, I have spoken against the rest of the nations and against all Edom. Edom today is a reference to the land that Esau settled in, which is basically in Jordan, that part of the area of their Moab, Edom. For glee and with malice in their hearts, they made what? My land, not their land, my land, their own possession, so that they might plunder its pasture land. Now, think about Israel today. Before Israel and the Jews began to restore and develop their drip irrigation system, and before they became the leading exporter of fruits, citrus fruits, $1.5 billion of exports per year to Europe, the leading exporter. If you go back and you look at a map of Israel in the late 1800s, 1900s, even into the 1948 period, it was all desolate. But they've turned that land into a blossoming rose, just like we read in Ezekiel 37. That's a prophecy that's been fulfilled. And so, with malice in their heart, they take the land, made it their possession, so that they might plunder its pasture land. That's kind of a reference, I think, to today, because much of Israel still, there's a lot of desert in Israel, but much of it is like a pasture land. And so what do we have? We've got Iran, we've got Turkey, we've got Hamas, Hezbollah, other nations that are conspiring to wipe Israel off the face of the map, to, quote, drive them into the Mediterranean Sea. Why? Because now it's a pasture land. There was no interest in it before Israel took over, before the Jews took over Israel. This whole Palestinian liberation movement, the Palestinian Authority, didn't really come into play until 1964 under Yasser Arafat. So it's a relatively modern concept and phenomenon. Therefore, prophesy concerning the land of Israel. You know, isn't it interesting that it's always referred to as Israel in the Bible? It's never referred to as Palestine. You would think that if it was Palestine, it would say, prophesy concerning the land of Palestine. It doesn't. It's prophesy concerning the land of Israel. And say to the mountains and the hills, to the ravines and valleys, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I speak in my jealous wrath because you have suffered the scorn of the nations. Israel continues today to suffer the scorn of the nations. We just talked about the explosion of anti-Semitism. And while Israel is blinded and they're under the curse of blindness, if you will, to the gospel because of what they've done in the past, God loves them with an unbridled love, and he is going to redeem and restore and bring them back exactly like he's doing now. We're seeing the fulfillment of that today after all those years. I swear with an uplifted hand that the nations around you will also suffer scorn. And if you look at that word scorn, I believe in the Hebrew, it's basically the same as wrath. That's going to be under God's wrath. The nations are going to experience God's wrath. We'll see that up close and personal when this confederacy attempts to attack them, as outlined in Ezekiel 38 and 39. They are going to be scorned. They're going to experience God's wrath. So Ezekiel 36, 1 through 7. Talks about these invading foreign armies, his burning jealousy, his land. He raised his hand against them. This is a rebuke of the nations that have come to take the land for themselves. God gave it to them. He didn't give it. He allows, or would allow, just as we see the Israelis and the Jews do, allow anybody to visit there and to live there, but he gave control of the land to the Jewish people and give it to anybody else. Nobody has a right to tell Israel what to do with their land. Not the United States, not the United Nations, not the Catholic Church, not Saudi Arabia, not the European Union. Nobody has a right to tell Israel what to do with Jerusalem and Israel. But yet they continue to do so today. We still have these peace plans, and I can tell you the current administration, unlike the last administration, is pushing again for this two-state solution, to take that little tiny 8,000 square mile piece of land and divide it further. And it's never going to work. There's never going to be a time when Israel and the so-called state of Palestine can coexist, because it is the Palestinians or the Arabs, the radical ones at least, intent to take all of the land. If you look at a map of Israel, or you look at a map of the Middle East in a lot of textbooks in Arab nations, you don't even see Israel. It's not there. They don't believe that they have a right to even exist. So it has nothing to do with a two-state solution. But yet God has made it very clear. And these nations that are conspiring against God. So God gave them the title deed to control the land. Others can live there, but it was given to the Jews as an everlasting. Remember, all the way back in Genesis 12, in Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the Psalms. Throughout the Old Testament, God repeats over and over and over again. Always refers back to what? My covenant with them. Not the law, not the Mosaic covenant, my covenant, that unconditional, unilateral, everlasting promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and to their descendants. Think about it, that when it comes to Israel, God created a people. Remember, we go back to Genesis 12, where he told Abram that from you will come a nation. He created a nation, a people that never before existed. And he created them for a purpose, to be the people through whom he would reveal himself. If we look a little bit further in Genesis, or in Ezekiel 38, or 36, I'm sorry. If we look at verses 23, God says, I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord. So God always reveals himself through Israel. He's done so before. He certainly did so in 1948. He did so with the War of Independence. He did so during the Six-Day War and in Ezekiel. Think about this, that since 1901 through 2020, there have been 900, what do you call them? 900, not Pulitzer Prizes, 900, what's the term I'm looking for? 900 Nobel Prizes, 900 Nobel Prizes in that period of time. That during that period of time, 900 of which 203 or 23% have been awarded to Jews. Chemistry, biology, literature, 23% of all Nobel Prize winners were Jews. And if you think about the fact that compared to the world, they represent about 0.19% of the world's population. The Muslims, the Arabs, on the other hand, represent 23% of the world's population. Not to demean Muslims or anything like that, but this is just factual. During that same period of time, they've had 12 people, 12, representing 23% of the world's population, 12 Nobel Prize winners versus Israel's 203 that come from 1.19%. Why is that? Because God has been with them. And you think about the technology and the advances and the benefits that Israel and has had on the world in terms of biology and technology and just one thing after another. Every time you turn around, they have some new technology that nobody has even thought about, let alone developed. And so why would any people want to destroy the source of so much ingenuity and technology and innovation? It's satanic. It's absolutely satanic. So if we think about going back to our verses here in Ezekiel 23, for I, God, will take you. Let me go back up into 23. I will show the holiness of my great name. So in other words, it is not because of them necessarily that he's doing it. He does have a covenant with them, but it's because of his holy name that he's doing these things. He's going to prove himself to be the God of grace, love, mercy through the Jewish people. And he does the same for us, if you think about it. He doesn't wish that any should perish, that all should come to repentance. He forgives us. We might have to spend some time in the woodshed, but he's a loving God, and he reveals his love and his character, who he is and what he does through Israel. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord. So he's going to work through Israel to demonstrate to the nations, not just to Israel, but to the nations as well, that he is the sovereign Lord when I am proved holy through your very eyes. So God has multiple purposes for everything he does. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into what? Your own land, not the land of the United Nations or the Palestinians. It's your land. It's my land, but I've given it to you. And so it's amazing that we've seen that happen in most of our lifetimes. And even today, many, many Jews, the numbers continue to increase of Jews from around the world making Aliyah, which is moving back to Israel. So they're doing it in huge numbers even today because God has been stirring their hearts to bring them back. As he said, I will bring you back to your own land, exactly what we see. Then he says, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. So let's think about that, and then we'll finish on this thought and continue with this next week, because we get into 37, particularly where we see the valley of the dry bones coming together. I think one of the most uplifting, important 14 or so verses in all of the Bible. And we'll go into that in greater detail next week. But we know, because, as I said at the beginning, Ezekiel follows a chronological order. And God says here that I am going to bring you back into the lands that I scattered you to. I'm going to bring you back from all of those lands. I'm going to bring you back into Israel. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you. Then I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. And so we see that God has this amazing plan, and it's chronological. So He's bringing them back from the four corners largely in unbelief. In other words, most Jews have not yet reached the point where they accept Jesus Christ as their God. But that's what the tribulation is really all about, because we read in Romans that all Israel will be saved, which is a reference at the end of the tribulation to Jews that will all recognize him when he returns. And of course, we're coming back with him, very clearly stated in Zechariah and Colossians and Revelation and First Thessalonians. Very, very clear that we're coming back with him. Well, if we're coming back with him at the end of the 7-year tribulation, we got to get there first. More on that later. So he's got this order. He's going to bring them back. He scattered them. But amazingly, they never lost their identity. Never lost their identity. Never lost their heritage. And then brings them back from the four corners of the world in unbelief. So that when they come back, then the clock really begins to tick. All these other peripheral things happen and ultimately leads to the time when they will become their God and he will accept them. One final thing. I mentioned earlier that when they came back from the four corners of the earth, and think about this, they had to have a common language. If you think about them coming back from the four corners of the earth, speaking all manner of languages, that they had to have one language. The Hebrew language had essentially been lost. Well, lo and behold, in the early 1900s, God motivated a fellow by the name of Eliezer Belhagen or something like that. I'll get his exact name for you next week. And he said, we need to restore the original Hebrew language. And that's exactly what he did. He spent the rest of his life restoring the pure Hebrew language so that when the people came back, they would learn the language. Well, he began and made it mandatory that his family all speak the pure language, and then his neighbors, and then ultimately other people. And, if you think about it, that the Hebrew language had been lost way back before Christ. Christ didn't speak Hebrew. He spoke Aramaic, which was the language of the Babylonians. And so when the people are scattered, they're speaking English, they're speaking French, they're speaking German, Russian, whatever. So they had to have a common language. Well, what do we read in Zechariah chapter 3? I think it's, or Zephaniah chapter 3, if I can find it here. In verse 9, it says, I will purify the lips of the people, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. And in some translation, I believe it actually talks about the restore the language. So it's God who clearly motivated this fellow to restore the language after all those years, so that all the people, when they come back and get back into the land, speak a common language. Now, Bob just reminded me that now I've gone beyond 8 o'clock. I apologize for going so long. Didn't get to everything I wanted to go over, but I just think that it's important as we're looking around today and we're seeing all of these things taking place in the world, that what is of great significance is what's going on in Israel. And we haven't talked about the threat of a war between Israel and Iran. That's a very real threat. You've probably been reading about it in the news. And Israel just simply cannot afford for Iran to develop any nuclear weapons whatsoever, because they're at 8,000 square miles. It's a one-bomb nation. You lob a nuclear warhead into Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, that would effectively be it. That would spread to the point where all of Israel would be devastated. So they absolutely have to do something. In the meantime, we have an administration that continues to think that they can operate diplomatically or work diplomatically with Iran. It can't be done. It's an impossibility. Just one more thing, if in fact they are to come up with a new Mideast peace plan or a new plan with Iran, that it's doomed to fail. It will not work, and it just further puts our leaders and, as a result, this nation under judgment. I think God's beginning to judge this country. I think we're seeing evidence of it. I think it's only going to get worse. As I was listening to Amir the other day, and I'm sure others probably heard him as well, who said, don't think that 2022 is going to be better than 2021. Things are going to continue to escalate. Now, for us as believers, the rapture can happen any minute. That's our hope, as we'll find out in Titus 2:13. Our blessed hope is the return of Jesus Christ for his church. And that can happen, and it will happen, before a lot of the really bad stuff happens throughout the world. So, with that, I'm going to end it now. And hopefully it gives you a little different perspective. And I know a lot of us have been through this before, but I think it's important because we talk about a lot of these peripheral things, but so important to stay close to Israel. Let me just close this in prayer. Father, I just thank you for this time, and thank you for all the folks that are here and listening. I pray, Lord, that we always rightly divide your word. There's no room for any spiritualizing or just changing your word in any way to meet our own needs. It is what it is. The plain sense makes common sense, and that's what we try to do, Lord, is to divide your word rightly and in a literal fashion. I pray that you bring us all back together next week. I know that we'll be over the COVID by that time, and look forward to again being with as many of this group as possible in person. I pray for everyone here. Pray, Lord, that you bless us, and Lord, help us to remember your words, that when we begin to see these things happen, to look up, for our redemption draws near. We pray all these things in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Good night.